The battlefield was chaos. Mud, steel, and shouting men lost in the crush. One soldier, caught in the fray, barely saw the blade coming. He wasn't a knight, he didn't wear gilded armor or ride into battle with a family crest. He was a lowly foot soldier, one of thousands, fighting in the mud and chaos of the 14th century. The sword slipped past his shield, found the gap in his chainmail, and struck with precision. He staggered, breath gone, vision narrowing. For a heartbeat, he thought it was the end. But he didn't fall. Later, when the minimal armor that he was wearing was peeled away, they found the blade buried deep, but not deep enough. What had stopped it? It wasn't a miracle, it wasn't luck or anything like that. It was just layers of stitched linen and wool, worn close to the body. A gambeson. Simple. Overlooked. And on that day, the reason he walked away. Welcome to Midnight Makery. This is a podcast for the curious and the crafty. Around here, we craft together as I tell you stories about the mysterious, about history, about folklore. If it's strange and meaningful, I probably like to talk about it. Today, we're going to talk about a craft that has been preserved through generations. So grab your beverage of choice and your current project and sit back and relax while I talk to you about the history of quilting. So before we get into the podcast, I just wanted to start with a disclaimer. I am a one-person team and everything that I research is just purely based on my own interests. So I am probably going to make some mistakes or find a piece of information that's not accurate or totally true. If there are any discrepancies that you notice in this podcast, please feel free to tell me in the comments below. I'm more than happy to learn from my mistakes and fix them for the future. I also wanted to mention that there is a lot of terminology and nomenclature in this podcast that is not my native tongue. So for example, Japanese or terms from India. I tried my best again to look up the pronunciations of these words, but of course, since it's not my native tongue, I'm probably going to mispronounce a couple words, and I do apologize for that, but I did try my best. So if you have any tips for pronunciation, please also leave them in the comments below. I hope you like the episode. Quilting is often thought of as a quiet domestic art, but its origins are ancient and practical, and surprisingly pretty widespread on the globe. The very first evidence of quilting dates back to around 3400 BCE. Yes, 5,000 years ago. In the tombs of Egyptian pharaohs, archaeologists found remnants of quilted textiles. I love me a craft project, but these quilts in particular were made for protection. Imagine quilted fabric being used as padded clothing under bronze armor. Egypt wasn't the only place using quilted fabric. Similar techniques were also discovered in ancient China, where warriors used padded garments to help absorb blows in battle. In Mongolia and Central Asia, quilted horse blankets were quite common, providing both warmth and a layer of defense for these powerful and important animals that carried warriors into war. What makes quilting unique is its structure. 3 layers: the top fabric, insulation or batting in the middle, and backing. All of this held together by stitched thread. This structure is incredibly effective, whether you're trying to stay warm in the Himalayan foothills or survive a slash from a blade. Even at this early stage of quilting, function and beauty still went hand in hand. Some of the earliest quilted pieces showed intricate stitching patterns like geometric motifs, flowing lines, even symbolic shapes, so it wasn't all utilitarian, but also a means of expression, an art. Now, to clear a couple things up, quilting, patchwork, and applique are not interchangeable terms, although people, myself included, often lump them together. Quilting refers to the act of sewing 3 layers together with stitching. Patchwork is the technique of piecing together small fabric sections into a larger design, and applique is the process of sewing shapes of fabric onto a background fabric. These techniques often overlap in a finished quilt, but historically they developed for very different reasons, and their use varied depending on the materials available. A super interesting example I read about was the Tristan quilt, which was a series of quilted panels dating to the 13th century-ish that reflected storytelling practices from earlier medieval traditions. The panels depict scenes from the legend of Tristan and Isolde. Think like a comic book, but in fabric. I'll talk more about this in a bit, but it's a nice reminder that quilting always had the potential to do more than just insulate. They could communicate. When we think of the Middle Ages, our minds often leap to castles and knights and plague doctors, maybe even Monty Python. Quilting had some pretty interesting uses in this time as well. Let's go back to the 12th century, the age of the Crusades. Knights in chainmail looked intimidating, but chainmail alone was a brutal burden on the body. Can you imagine steel rings digging into your skin as you moved, as you rode or fought in battle? Ouch, that's painful. This is where quilted garments came in, specifically the gambeson. The gambeson was a thickly padded coat, often quilted with vertical or diamond-shaped stitching, and it was worn underneath chainmail. Its purpose was to absorb the impact of swords, maces, and arrows, and keep the metal armor from rubbing flesh raw. In some cases, a well-made gambeson could be worn on its own, especially by foot soldiers who couldn't really afford full sets of armor. Layers of linen or wool were stuffed with raw cotton, horsehair, or even moss, and it was stitched together to become a surprisingly effective defense. Although, if your gambeson was full of moss, I'd imagine you would have other issues after a little while and some moisture. Apart from the battlefield, quilting started to make its way into the household as well. Quilting techniques found new purpose in bedding and clothing for the medieval elite. In the 13th and 14th century Europe, particularly in France and Italy, quilted bed covers started appearing in wealthy households. These were whole cloth quilts, made from one large continuous piece of expensive fabric, and were often stitched with intricate patterns, vines, stars, flowers, or heraldic designs. The quilting itself became decoration. So let's go back to the Tristan quilt I mentioned earlier. This quilt is believed to have been made in Sicily around the year 1360 and is part of a pair. It was made of linen and stuffed with wool. The Tristan quilt tells the legendary tale of Tristan and Isolde through detailed stitch scenes. It was a story quilt, centuries before patchwork became a thing. The stitches outline castles, knights on horseback, lovers in boats. Imagine the time it took to handmake this. Some of these more narrative quilts became very symbolic. They reflected literacy, wealth, and artistic appreciation. Often people displayed these quilts on their wall, or draped over a carved wooden chest, or used to line a fancy canopy bed. It was essentially a status symbol. In the courts of England and France, quilted clothing started to become more fashionable too. Women wore quilted petticoats for warmth, while both genders wore quilted doublets, which were tight-fitting jackets with really elaborate stitching. You could almost say that quilting even influenced the silhouette of medieval fashion. So, in less than 300 years, quilting transformed from blood-soaked armor liner to a canvas for mythic storytelling and couture. But let's not forget the labor behind the luxury. Even now, with all of our fancy sewing machines, quilting is time-consuming. It's meticulous, and it's physically demanding. Stitching dense fabrics with thick thread, often without good lighting in the medieval ages, was no easy task. It was women, mostly, who did this work. Nuns in convents stitched altar cloths and garments. Noble women worked on trousseau for their daughters. Servants and tradeswomen contributed behind the scenes. In many ways, the quilted textile became a testimony to female craftsmanship in an age where women's voices were rarely recorded. And while few examples from this time survive, if you think about it, fabric is quite perishable. Medieval manuscripts and paintings often depict quilted patterns and give us a teaser into what has been lost. As we step into the 16th and 17th centuries, the world is changing fast. This is the age of exploration, expanding empires, and lavish European courts. And of course, alongside the rise of powdered wigs and ruffled collars, quilting is evolving once again. By this time, quilting has drifted firmly into the domestic and decorative sphere, especially among the aristocracy. Fabric was more available than in the medieval period thanks to expanding trade networks. Wealthy women across France, Italy, and England are spending leisure hours stitching elaborate quilted items as a sign of refinement. Let's start with one of the most iconic quilted garments of the era, the quilted petticoat. In the 17th and 18th centuries, quilted petticoats were elegant, visible, and fashionable. They were the flashiest part of the outfit and peeked out beneath a split overskirt or tucked under a silk gown, often revealing glittering stitches and gleaming fabrics. Some were made of silk, taffeta, or fine linen, stitched with floral vines, birds, or Baroque scrolls, and often padded with cotton or wool to give the petticoat shape and warmth. In the winter, a quilted petticoat was invaluable, but for the elite, quilting was now a sign of status. The denser and more ornate the stitching, the more skilled the needlework, and therefore the higher your place was in society to be able to afford that. Quilting also became more structured and more formalized. Pattern books began circulating, especially in France and Italy. These books offered inspiration for many different kinds of decorative stitches and motifs. Embroidery and quilting were often taught together, sometimes in convent schools or as part of a noble girl's education. Girls were expected to master decorative needlework before they could be considered accomplished. Fun fact, there is actually a school of needlework in Europe still. It's called the Royal School of Needlework, and it looks like a castle. Google it, it's pretty interesting. In this period, there were two common styles. The first, whole cloth quilting, which we mentioned before, was still popular. These were often single color quilts where the stitching itself formed the design. Intricate scrolls, spirals, lattice work, and stylized botanical forms. The wealthier the maker, the finer the fabric, and the more detailed the quilting. The second type was called, and I'm sorry, please excuse me for my pronunciation, broderie perse, or Persian embroidery in French. It was interesting because instead of piecing together scraps into patchwork, makers would cut out floral motifs from printed chintz fabric, imported from places like India, and then applique them onto a larger cloth background. It was a way to show off some expensive fabric that you had and your skills in artistic arrangement, and it created an almost collage-like quilted surface. In many ways, this technique was a precursor to modern applique quilting. Let's go beyond Europe. The 17th century marks the rise of European colonial empires, and with them, the circulation of textiles on a more global scale. Quilts, or at least quilted textiles, began to show up in manifests, inventories, and shipments that were sent to the New World. If you think about it, in colonial America, quilting is a luxury. Early settlers had far more urgent needs than decorative bed covers. They needed shelter and food and simple warmth, and quilted goods were extremely rare and expensive, and so they had to be brought over from Europe. Some of the earliest recorded quilts in the colonies were whole cloth quilts, or broderie perse bed covers, passed down through generations and treasured as heirlooms. Some quilted items were even listed in early American wills. A flowered quilt or blue quilted counterpane might be passed to a daughter or a niece, recorded with the same care as the silver or land. The quilting bees became a thing in this time period as well. Quilting bees, or communal gatherings where women stitched together, began to pop up in some communities, especially in New England. These were social occasions. They were often tied to courtship or milestones. A group might work on a quilt for a young women's wedding chest, or collaborate on a community quilt to mark a birth or death. Sometimes the bride-to-be was expected to complete 13 quilts before marriage, 12 practice quilts, and 1 best quilt for the wedding night. As we move into the early 19th century, we see the rise of piecework. Why now? Well, because fabric became cheaper thanks to early industrialization and domestic textile production. Suddenly, cotton was now being mass-produced, and a range of colors and patterns were all suddenly within reach. Also, women's magazines like Godey's Ladies Book and the Ladies Repository began circulating quilt block patterns, stitching guides, and ladies' work columns. And of course, quilting, especially in rural areas, was one of the few acceptable creative outlets for women. It was in this time period that we see the emergence of many classic patterns, like the log cabin, symbolizing home and hearth, flying geese, nine patch, and later more symbolic designs like the Tree of Life, the double wedding ring, or the Ohio Star. During the 1860s, quilting became a tool of activism and patriotism. During the American Civil War, women made comfort quilts or soldiers' quilts, and also used quilts as a way to raise funds for the Union Army. But let's not romanticize this too much. Quilting in early America wasn't just a creative hobby. Though quilting was considered a genteel art in elite circles, it was also deeply rooted in labor. Working class women, enslaved women, and indigenous women also quilted, but their work was rarely credited to them, recorded, or preserved. These women made simple, sturdy quilted items, bedrolls, coats, linings. They used coarse fabrics and minimal ornamentation. In many cases, they also stitched the luxurious garments worn by the elite. Their hands are in the stitches, even if history rarely names them. Enslaved women in the American South often sewed and quilted for their enslavers, producing bed covers, clothing, and household goods. In some cases, they stitched for their own families, too, using scraps from plantation households or remnants of worn-out garments. These women helped pass down oral traditions, design motifs, and sometimes even symbolic meanings through quilts, though it's important to acknowledge that much of that history was not recorded by name. The quilts of Gee's Bend from Alabama are a good example of this. These quilts were made by black women descended from the enslaved people. There's also the enduring myth of freedom quilts, or quilt codes, being used on the Underground Railroad. I do have to mention, though, that while the idea of a secret language of patterns guiding enslaved peoples to freedom is powerful and pretty dang cool, historians have debated the accuracy of these. Most evidence for this theory comes from oral accounts collected much after, and there's very little documentation, if any at all, to support the idea that quilts carried encoded messages. Still, we do know that quilting was always more than stitching. It was a way of passing time, preserving memory, honoring the dead, and preparing for the future. So let's go into quilting in the 20th century. The early 20th century was a time for transformation, much like it was for crochet. If you haven't watched that episode, it's the very first craft along I did on this channel. This time period was defined by world wars, the rise of consumer culture, and the decline of rural life. Quilting adapted in this era too. During the Great Depression, unemployment soared and families scraped by however they could. Fabric, like everything else, was scarce, especially special quilting fabric. So women, the resourceful queens that they are, turned to feed sacks for quilting materials. Flour, sugar, and animal feed at the time were sold in cotton sacks, and by the 1930s, manufacturers caught on that people were making things out of this. So they began printing these sacks in bright colors and floral patterns, knowing homemakers would repurpose them into clothes, curtains, and of course, quilts. During this time, the creation of these quilts were a source of dignity and creativity in hard times. Some even organized quilt-making contests sponsored by newspapers or companies like Sears, offering cash prizes for innovation. Of course, during the World Wars, quilts became patriotic tools once more, just like they were in the American Civil War. Quilting groups raised money through raffles, sold war bond quilts, and people stitched themes of loyalty, liberty, and sacrifice into their designs. Some quilts from this time include hand-stitched flags, victory slogans, and even quilt blocks shaped like tanks and planes, all ways to feel a sense of hope during these dark times. By the 1950s, quilting entered a more quiet period. Post-war prosperity and the rise of mass-produced bedding made handmade quilts seem, for a time, old-fashioned. Women were encouraged to embrace modern things like nylon sheets, vacuum-sealed comforts, and everything new. Quilting was relegated to older women, rural communities, or cultural preservation societies. Thankfully, some quilters persisted. They gathered in church basements, 4-H clubs, and state fairs. They passed on patterns, they taught their children, and they frankly kept the tradition alive, but barely. Then, surprisingly, in the 60s and 70s, quilting came back. It was fueled by the US bicentennial in 1976. Americans suddenly found themselves looking back at their roots. People were hungry for heritage, authenticity, and connection. Quilts, with their rich legacy, fit that bill perfectly. There was an explosion of interest. Quilt guilds formed across the country, quilt shows and state exhibitions flourished, scholarly work and museum collections emerged, and traditional quilt patterns were reprinted and repopularized. It wasn't just nostalgic either. The 70s revival sparked something new, a generation of quilters who wanted to innovate now. During this time, the modern quilt artists emerged. People like Molly Upton, Rad O'Donnell, and Nancy Crow began experimenting with color, shape, and scale. They used bold abstraction, asymmetry. They improvised a lot. Sometimes they completely abandoned grids and symmetry altogether. They produced gallery-worthy quilts, and quilts officially crossed into the fine art territory during this time. In the 1980s and 90s, quilts began to reflect activism and identity. A powerful example I found was the AIDS Memorial Quilt. It was originally conceived in 1987 by activist Cleve Jones. The quilt is it's a massive community art project where each panel commemorates a person who passed away from AIDS. Sewn by friends, family, and lovers, it has grown to over 50,000 individual panels. An impressive and living archive of grief, rage, and remembrance. When it was first unfurled on the National Mall in Washington, D.C., it stunned the States, and it remains one of the most moving uses of quilting in public memory. Other activists were also using quilting to bring attention to their causes. They used the craft to explore issues for race, gender, environment, and politics. Groups like the Women of Color Quilters Network, which was founded in 1985, carved out space for African American quilters to share stories, traditions, and push back against exclusion in the mainstream quilt world. By the end of the 20th century, quilting was a form of protest. It was a keeper of memory. It was a fine art medium. It was a tradition passed down from previous generations, and for many, a therapeutic, meditative act in an increasingly noisy world. I realize I'm focusing mainly on North America, but it's important to remember the roots of quilting. It was, and still is, a very universal craft. In Japan, for example, sashiko, which means little stabs, is a traditional embroidery technique developed in the Edo period, which involves sewing simple white thread in repetitive geometric patterns onto layers of cloth. Some patterns that Japanese people sewed onto their quilts were super intentional. Patterns like the asanoha, which was the hemp leaf, segaiha, waves, and kaki no hanazashi, persimmon flower, all hold symbolic meanings invoking protection, prosperity, or longevity. In India and Bangladesh, there is a technique called kanta. Kanta is a form of hand-stitched layered cloth made by recycling old saris and dhotis. Women would stack several pieces of fabric and then stitch them together with tiny rippling rows of running stitches. Some kantas were minimal, but others had motifs like birds, elephants, folk stories, and even personal dreams. It's cool because traditionally kantas weren't made with a pattern, but instead were organically created by the maker freehand. These kanta quilts were traditionally made for babies, beds, or spiritual offerings, but now they have become internationally popular, featured in fashion, home design, and artwork. Now let's go back to Hawaii. And I don't mean American Hawaii, I mean Hawaii, when it was still its own kingdom. When the missionaries arrived in the 1820s, they introduced Western quilting methods to native Hawaiian women. But instead of just adopting their techniques, they created their own distinct style, which is called Hawaiian applique quilting. The technique is inspired by paper cutting, where large symmetrical motifs are folded and cut from a single piece of cloth, and then appliqued onto a contrasting background. The motifs often featured stylized versions of native plants like taro, breadfruit, or hibiscus, and the result was massive, elegant quilts with bold and graphic designs. Some of these quilts became deeply symbolic and were politicized in the late 19th century when the Hawaiian monarchy was overthrown. They were acts of resistance, stitched with royal emblems, dates of injustice, or mourning designs during Queen Liliuokalani's imprisonment. Jumping continents, let's go to Africa. In West Africa, techniques like strip weaving in kente cloths, involved sewing together narrow woven strips of fabric with bold geometric patterns and symbolic colors. Not exactly quilting, but it was similar in that this technique produced a garment built of many individual parts. In South Africa, and among other refugee communities, we also find story cloths. These cloths, as their name suggests, told stories that documented migration, resistance, or community life. One example is the work of Ubuntu quilters who used applique and embroidery to tell powerful stories about apartheid, HIV, and social justice. I'm really not kidding when I say quilting techniques were universal. Let's go to Central and South America. In Panama, the indigenous Guna people practiced a textile art called mola. Mola is a reverse applique panel made by layering brightly colored fabrics and cutting away parts of each layer to reveal some sort of a design. Mola's garments usually had themes of animals, plants, myths, and other symbols of identity. They made some pretty gorgeous wearable art and were a form of, again, cultural resistance, especially in the face of colonial suppression. In other parts of Central and South America, patchwork techniques also flourished, which kind of blended European colonial quilting influences with indigenous traditional techniques. So, what do all these global quilting styles have in common? Well, I think it really goes to show how resourceful quilters are, or were and are. Also, it certainly helped preserve memory and tradition and also fostered a sense of community. Today, global quilting communities continue to cross-pollinate, if you will. Japanese sashiko stitched into denim jackets in New York, Indian kanta reinterpreted on runways in Paris, South African applique telling stories in global art galleries, and with the internet, digital communities, and quilting festivals around the world, we are really seeing a true global reconnaissance of quilting, one that both honors cultural roots while allowing for and permitting modern interpretations. Now we're in the 21st century. In 2009, modern quilters founded the Modern Quilt Guild, which now has chapters around the world. Their annual event, QuiltCon, is part exhibition and part community celebration. Fun fact, if you were there this year, if you were on QuiltCon 2025, one of my good friends went with a couple stickers I designed, and let me know in the comments if you ended up with an emotional support sewing machine or one of the bobbin chickens from Hello Rosie, because I drew those, and I think that'd be pretty cool if I could find somebody that has one of those now. Anyway, the 21st century also introduced something quilting had never seen before: technology. Quilters now use computer-aided design software to draft complex patterns. They use long-arm quilting machines that can digitally stitch entire quilts from uploaded files. There are laser cutters, Cricut machines, fabric machines, and all of these have brought a new level of precision. And how can I forget to mention the most radical technology: the internet. Quilters today connect through Instagram, TikTok, YouTube. There are online quilt-alongs, Zoom-based quilting bees, there are digital swaps, and Patreon quilting education. For many, the quilting community now spans time zones and continents, which I think is pretty dang cool. At the same time, many contemporary quilters are turning to slow crafts and sustainable practices. Especially in our world of overconsumption, quilting is a way to provide a powerful counter-narrative. Quilters are using reclaimed fabrics, they try to be zero waste, there are slow stitching movements that emphasize mindfulness and sustainability. This sounds really similar to my crochet history craft along now, but quilting these days is deeply tied to mental health and healing. During the weird time warp we went through in 2020, there was a dramatic resurgence of quilting as people were stuck at home and found a way to keep themselves busy, and it was a really nice way to connect with other people around the world through quilting communities. Quarantine quilts emerged as personal time capsules, documenting some people's isolation, their fear, their loss, but was also a way that many people found some peace. I am not a quilter myself, although I have been tempted to collect yet another hobby, but for many, quilting became therapy. It was a place to put anxiety, grief, or longing into some sort of tangible form and to make something beautiful during something hard. So, where is quilting going to go in the future? Quilting has always been a reflection of its time. In ancient tombs and medieval armories, in colonial kitchens and on Civil War battlefields, in Depression-era homesteads and modern art galleries, quilts have captured something essential about the human experience, and it's our need to make, to remember, and to connect. Looking at the future of quilting, or any handcraft for that matter, might seem a little bit scary considering the advancements in mass-produced everything. But to those who know that these handmade crafts aren't going anywhere, the future is infinite. We're in an era where quilting is no longer confined by tradition, but carried forward by the curious. Quilting remains to be a way of connecting parts into a whole. It connects scraps of material, yeah, but also scraps of history, of memory, of family, of place. It teaches patience in a fast world, slowness in this digital age, and attention to detail in our culture that chases the big picture. So, what will quilts of the future look like? Some might be purely digital. You can take a look at the HIV/AIDS quilt now online. Some might be worn, walked through, or projected on walls. Some might never leave someone's cozy bedroom, while others might tour international museums. But every stitch, I think anyway, whether it was made by hand or machine, it will be a moment of care, a moment of presence. And maybe that's the future we need. One where art isn't just beautiful, but also meaningful. One where we inherit the patterns of the past, but aren't afraid to make new ones. One where quilting remains what it has always been, a beautiful art form that fosters creativity and community. Anyways, that's it for me tonight. Thank you for slowing down with me again and crafting with me. If you have any stories to share, please comment below. I love reading the comments I get. Mind you, I only get like 1 or 2, but I love all of them. Please comment. Please talk to me. If you like this, please consider liking the video and subscribing. I talk about many things in this craft along that pique my interest: folklore, history, true crime, spooky, supernatural things. I like all of it. So if you have any suggestions in those topics, please let me know. I hope you got some work on your project done, and I'll see you next episode. Bye.